Good evening, everybody. Mainly addressed to everybody who's online as opposed to in the club room. So, tonight we have Mike Frost. Lives in the English county of Warwickshire, and he works as a systems engineer in the steel business. During the day, he's an amateur astronomer in his leisure time. He pursues eclipses and goes to astronomical places all over the world. In addition, is a member of the Coventry and Warwickshire Astronomical Society, the Society for the History of Astronomy, the British Astronomical Association, and the Royal Astronomical Society. In addition, he produces papers and delivers speeches to societies all around the United Kingdom and beyond when required. So can everybody please put their hands together and give Mike Frost a good Mixborough and Swinton Astronomical Society welcome. Thank you.
What pleasure to come and what a pleasure to speak to you again. I came up to Mixborough and Swinton a few years ago, I think, to talk about Isaac Newton and the Surrey Pumas. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. We live in peculiar times, and got to two people in the normal meeting place and everybody else on Zoom, and people logging in from all over the place. I'm impressed to see people from other societies. Hello, welcome along. And Zoom talks have their advantages and their disadvantages. I think I suspect I won't be the only one who looks forward to the day when we're all meeting in person again. So let me start my presentation. So I have to share screen, and you should see my PowerPoint presentation coming up. And if I do from beginning, you should see. Come on. So you can all see? Yep, good. Right. So anyway, my name is Mike Frost. I run the historical section of the British Astronomical Association, and I'm a member of the Society for the History of Astronomy. So I am interested in dead astronomers from, all over the place, but I tend to concentrate on people from my neck of the woods, local people in Warwickshire and the surrounding counties. When I came to talk to you previously, I drove all the way up the M1, joining at I think junction 19, right the way up to about 28, 29, isn't it? So it's a fair old way. Rugby is where the M1 meets the M6, right in the middle of the country. So I'm going to tell you about an unexpected astronomer I found from Rugby. But let me start with another of my local dead astronomers, just to put you in the picture. If you don't know my part of the world. So as I say, Rugby is pretty much right in the middle of England. About 15 miles or so to the northeast of Rugby is Leicestershire, and a small market town called Market Harborough in the southern part of Leicestershire. And about halfway between the two, between Rugby and Market Harborough, is the little village of South Kilworth. And I gave a talk to Market Harbour Historical Society. I can't see the date of it. It's about 5 or 6 years ago. That it's up at the top. You can see it and I can't. About somebody who lived in South Kilworth, the Reverend Dr. William Pearson, co-founder of the Royal Astronomical Society, and with the help of Caroline Bedwell from the Leicester Astronomical Society, we launched a campaign to get a plaque on the rectory in South Kilworth, from where he did much of his observing. And right at the beginning of 2020, just before the pandemic started, 3 days after the 200th birthday of the Royal Astronomical Society, we had the celebration, put up the plaque commemorating one of its founders. So you may recognise one or two people on that picture there. Nick Hewitt, from a good friend of mine from the British Astronomical Association, on the right-hand side. Immediately to my right, as on that picture, is Professor Emma Bunce from Leicester University, who's was the president of the Royal Astronomical Society at the time. She did the unveiling, and various people, Gerald Gilligan from the Society, the chair of the Society for the History of Astronomy, various other people from Leicester University. We had a great day, and we knew there was this pandemic. We knew this COVID virus coming around. It doesn't look we're all squeezed together, and before very long we were no longer able to go anywhere near anybody else. So we were just in time to unveil the plaque. Anyway, because South Kilworth is pretty close to Market Harbour, I gave Market Harbour a talk about Reverend William Pearson, which seemed to go down pretty well at the Historical Society. And after the meeting, a chap called Bob Hakewill walked up to me. He's known as the history man in Market Harbour. He's very keen on the history of the town, and he was keen to tell me about another local astronomer. And I was very, very keen to hear from him because I'm always intrigued to talk to people who are enthusiastic about astronomical history, as I am. I know there are always good stories to be told, many of which I don't actually know. And it turned out that this was somebody I'd never heard of previously. Here he is. His name is the Reverend George Fisher. I don't think he could get more Victorian if you tried. Very dignified-looking chap, reclining in his chair, but clearly an astute person. And Bob Hakewill said, well, he's buried in Market Harbour, but he didn't actually live there. He lived in Rugby. And Bob didn't actually know that I was from Rugby, so this was an extra surprise to me. There's this astronomer that Bob Hakewill knew about that I knew nothing about, so I immediately my interest was piqued, and I started to find out something about him. For example, where he lived in Rugby, and here it is. It's the second from the left in this rather elegant block of terrace block, quite close to the centre of Rugby. It's only about a quarter of a mile or so away, just opposite Rugby School. And as we'll see shortly, that may or may not be of some significance. But there it is, very large Victorian windows, let in a lot of sunlight, as you might expect, and wrought ironwork railings and so on. It's a very nice place to live, I'm sure. Back in 1871, just after he arrived there, actually, these were the inhabitants of 11 Hill Morton Road, and he was the head of the family. At the age of 77, retired chaplain Royal Navy, and born Middlesex, Sunbury, as we'll see later. With him was his daughter, Alice Fisher, unmarried, born in Greenwich, a good place for an astronomer to be born, and you'll see that's not a coincidence. And then three servants: Hester Hill from Tibbs Heath in Derbyshire, Elizabeth Malin, the local girl from Warwickshire, and Sarah Rowley from Peckleton in Leicestershire. So we knew who the people were in the building. I'll tell you a little bit more about Alice towards the end of the talk, but there is George, retired chaplain from the Royal Navy. Now, when I find out about people from my part of the world, I'll come to him in a second, it's always an interesting question as to what extent they are local astronomers. The great thing about the Reverend William Pearson was that he lived pretty close to Rugby, and he observed from pretty close to Rugby. In South Kilworth, he built not one but two observatories, and he did decades of useful astronomy there, mostly positional astronomy, using some of the best telescopes that were available in Britain at that time. So there is no doubt that that Reverend William Pearson was a Leicestershire astronomer, and that's where he did his observing from. And now, as I've done my level best to find out whether or not Fisher did any observing from Rugby, but I can't say for absolutely certain, though there are some leading clues to say that perhaps he might have done a little bit. But he was quite old when he arrived here, so I don't think he did very much, if he did any at all. So, to what extent was he a Rugby astronomer? Well, let me point out another couple of people who are also Rugby astronomers, but only just. For example, 14th Astronomer Royal, Sir Arnold Wolfendale, unfortunately passed away a year or so ago. I met him once at a Society for the History of Astronomy event. He was a great speaker and very likable chap. When he found out I was from Rugby, he was very keen to tell me that was where he was born. Only had 15 astronomers royal, and one of them was born in Rugby, which is really good. Unfortunately, he only lived here for about 6 months, and then the family disappeared off up to Manchester, where he lived most of the rest of his life. So to say he was a Rugby astronomer is pushing it quite a long way. He was born here and nothing more. Not quite even an astronomer, but a notable figure from 20th century physics is Paul Dirac, the guy who came up with the concept of antimatter, one of the greatest, possibly the greatest British physicist of the 20th century. He wasn't born in Rugby, he was Bristolian, despite having that sort of French-sounding name. Everybody thinks he's French, but actually he had a West Country burr to his accent. But he studied electrical engineering to start off with at university because of a rather domineering father who insisted that was what he did. And so he came to Rugby as a vacation student to come and work at, I forget if it was English Electric, I think. in rugby, and I work on the same campus. It's now been renamed. We're now General Electric rather than English Electric. But he spent a summer in rugby. He absolutely hated it. Didn't talk to anybody else. Spent all his time in the library reading physics papers. So, is he a rugby astronomer or even a rugby scientist? Only just. Barely did anything here. So I don't think either of these two could really be counted as locals made good, even though one of them was born here and another did spend time studying here. A better bet would be Norman Lockyer, somebody else about whom I gave a lecture, who was born in Rugby, moved away with his family, but spent much of his early life in the Warwickshire area and returned to Rugby on many occasions. He never gave up his links with the town. He's the guy who discovered helium, and he was born in Sheep Street, right in the middle of Rugby. There's a plaque to him as well. So it's arguable whether or not we should consider Fisher as a rugby astronomer, but his life was so interesting that I'm going to tell you about him anyway. He was born Sunbury-on-Thames in Middlesex, so nowhere near Rugby, 2nd of October 1794, from an interesting family. His father was the architect surveyor for Hanover Square in London. Very posh address in the west of London. In those days, you could see that the contemporary print. Very desirable residential area. It's now offices. I'm sure you all know, because you've all been to the London headquarters of Vogue for a fashion shoot. That is actually in Hanover Square. So it is still a very desirable location, but unfortunately now too expensive to live there. You need to be a multinational corporation. Who need a prestigious address. Unfortunately, his father died in 1797. He was only 3 years old, so he and his brothers, at least 3 brothers, one of whom we don't know a lot about, so may have died young, but his mother brought up George and his brothers on her own. Now, it would be wrong, I think, to say that they were brought up in straitened circumstances, but probably not quite as wealthy as they would have been had his father survived. So he had to get a job. So at the age of 14, he joined the Westminster Fire Company. You might wonder what a fire company is, and essentially in those days it was an insurance company. They looked after buildings and so on, part of the thing about that was that there was no fire brigade at that time in London. There were private fire brigades who would come out and put out your fire, but they'd start negotiating with you, and I think the price would go up as the flames rose. So it's not a bad idea to have pre-bought your fire cover, and so you went to an insurance company, to a fire company, and said, we'll pay you such a sum of money. If there's a fire here, you'll come and put it out. And indeed, what they also did was employ porters and so on to get important stuff out of the building in a hurry before the fire really took hold. So it's a slightly different way of doing things. It's not that idea of a public utility at the time. But he was quite successful as part of the Westminster Fire Company. They actually awarded him a medal. And George Marty Stein, another historian, told me about all these and sent me a picture of his medals. Fire Company medal is the one on the left, and the obverse side is on the one on the right. And I'll tell you about the other one, which is rather more important, actually, the one in the middle a little bit later on. So he must have done pretty well in the fire company to actually be awarded a medal. I don't know if it's everybody got one, if you were there for a year's service and didn't actually burn a building down or whatever, but he clearly did the job well enough to be awarded something at it. But what he also did was somehow or other insinuate himself into the academic world in London at that time, the learned societies and so on. And as far as I know, all the other historians really don't know quite how he managed to do this, because he was only 1809 when he got the medal. He was still only about 15 years or so old. But somehow or other, perhaps he went along to meetings of the Royal Society and so on. Perhaps he asked all the right questions. But within a few years, his strong mathematical and scientific tastes had already declared themselves at the insurance company, and he got himself a place to read, I think it was natural sciences, at St Catherine's College in Cambridge, one of the Cambridge colleges, one of the older ones down by the river, certainly prestigious location to study. And he, in one of his obituaries, it says the names of Sir Joseph Banks, the great natural scientist, Sir Humphrey Davy, very famous for the Davy lamp and so on. Sir Everard Hume, with many others, were always gratefully mentioned by him. So somehow he managed to be friends. This young lad, still in his late teens, early 20s, managed to get to be friends with some of the great minds of the age and be appreciated what they were actually doing there. I would love to know more about this phase of his career. So he got to go to Cambridge University to study, which, as I say, is pretty accomplished for the young lad from the insurance company, but didn't stay there for that long. He did complete his degree in the end, but actually, first of all, he headed off to the Arctic. In 1818, he joined an expedition led by Captain David Buchan to try and sail across the Arctic Ocean. Remember, at that time, we hadn't been to the North Pole, and the received wisdom was that it was pretty bad sailing northwards, but actually there was an ocean there which was just about passable during the Arctic summer. Of course, we know that's not the case. The pack ice persists all year round. So yes, there is an ocean there, but it is permanently covered, permanently impassable, unless you happen to have an icebreaker, and they didn't. So he went out instead. They went out in two boats, the Dorothea and the Trent, well, perhaps almost inevitably, they went north to Spitzbergen. I've been to Spitzbergen myself. I saw the eclipse of the sun there in 2015. It is seriously far north, going on for 80 degrees north, halfway between the top of Norway and the North Pole, and north of Spitzbergen into almost uncharted territory, some of the furthest north people had ever been. They hit a terrible storm and had to turn back from there. So the expedition was not a success in doing what it was hoped to do, to try and sail across the Arctic Ocean. That was rather optimistic. But for himself, it was noted he'd managed to do useful science, in particular the idea of measuring a line of latitude. So what you're doing is measuring the length of a line of latitude, north-south line, between two places 1 degree apart. You can do it places half a degree apart and then multiply by 2 and so on. And you might say, well, that's going to be the same wherever you are on the world. And if the world was perfectly spherical, that would indeed be the case. But the world is not perfectly spherical. And there was this great scientific endeavor done for decades around the turn of the 18th to 19th century to measure lines of latitude in as many places as possible to try and find out the exact shape of the Earth, as we know now, an oblate spheroid, a sphere which bulges a little bit around the equator. Newton had predicted that, but it took the combined efforts of many explorers to remote parts of the world to actually confirm that that was the case. And as I say, Fisher was one of them, and this accomplishment was well received. So he did manage to get his degree, although curiously hampered by illness. And again, I'm not sure what sort of illness it might be. It might be something like consumption, tuberculosis, that kind of thing. But it makes it all the more remarkable that after he graduated, he was ordained more or less immediately, and he joined the Royal Navy as a chaplain and was recruited to join another polar expedition. Remember, not in the best of health. Would you want to go up to the far north on an expedition into the middle of nowhere, literally into uncharted territory? Well, George Fisher actually did this, and he joined the 1821 polar expedition organised by this chap, very dapper-looking young fella. In later life, this is what it looks like, a little bit more jowly at this point. His name was William Edward Parry, English admiral and Arctic explorer. Accompanied Sir John Ross's expedition, 1818, same time that Fisher was going up north on another expedition, discovery of the Northwest Passage, commanded an expedition himself in 1819, whilst Fisher was still completing his university degree, winning the government prize when he crossed longitude 110 west. So they'd managed to get further west than people had done before. His record in reaching latitude 82.45 north, a little bit further north than Spitzbergen, unsurpassed for nearly 50 years. This comes from a British Astronomical Association work, which I use. It's called Who's Who on the Moon. It's the first memoir of the BA historical section, published in the late 1940s, edited by my predecessor, the excellent Mary Evershed, solar astronomer, astronomical historian, Dante scholar, and the subject of a recent biography. And I'm pleased to tell you, I've been plugging this, a new version of Who's Who on the Moon is being produced at the moment, should come out in the next year or so, inspired by the Mary Evershed's book, but featuring some of the excellent lunar photography that's been done subsequently. So this is Parry's crater. It's in the in the top middle there. So the Apollo 16 image is on the left, and then a more detailed image from Luna 4 on the right hand side near Fra Mauro. So obviously, because it's prior to us seeing what the far side of the moon looked like, it's on the near side, near one of the Apollo 12 was Fra Mauro. I can't remember. You guys probably know better than me, but it is in the part of the moon that we're all familiar with. So Parry actually had a crater named for him that in the great moon map of Mädler and Beer, the German lunar astronomers from the middle of the 19th century. They like to name craters after important figures from exploration in that great exploring era, and Parry was quite rightly, I think, considered one of them. So these are the two boats that they sailed on, the Fury in the foreground and the Hecla in the background. And again, don't forget, these are wooden sailing ships sailing into the middle of nowhere, sailing right into the middle of the pack ice. It must have been sometimes quite a scary experience, I'm sure, when the ice was getting thicker and thicker. One has to admire the courage that you have to do to sail in these circumstances. There's an excellent account. You can find it online. Just search for it, and I'm fairly sure the journal for the second voyage, the discovery of a Northwest Passage. You remember the first one was quite successful, 1819, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So that was the idea, was you cut out this tedious sailing around Cape Horn, around South America, try and get to the Pacific by sailing around the top of North America, around the top of Canada. Performed in the years 1821, 22, 23 in His Majesty's ships Fury and Hecla under the orders of Captain William Edward Parry, Royal Navy, Fellow of the Royal Society, commander of the expedition, illustrated by numerous plates, which I shall show you, published by authority of the Lords Commissioners of the Admiralty. So it's a good read. I've read all the way through. It's a learned paper. It's meant to be a complete account of the journey, so there's a lot of it, but it does there are places just excellent read. They overwintered twice, as you can tell. The start of 1821, come back 1823. First of all at Winter Island, and they named features on the island after various the officers on the boat. So there is Cape Fisher on the south of the island, named after the Reverend George. And then second winter at the Inuit, or Eskimo as they keep calling them, the settlement at Igloo Lake. They were going to stay a third year, but halfway through the second year, scurvy appears on the boat, and it's quite shocking reading, where one guy comes down with it, the next day 2 or 3 others come down with it, and within 3 or 4 days they've decided to abandon the entire expedition. They knew how quickly scurvy could just race through a boat, so they had to sail home in a hurry. So the pictures are, sorry, let me tell you where they're going to, just to get you up to speed. So that's Canada. I hope you recognize, with Greenland, the white stuff to the right of it, and Iceland to the right of that. Spitzbergen would be right at the top of that, further to the right still. And you see Hudson Bay, which discovered or was explored by Europeans in the 17th and then the 18th centuries, and it's the northern reaches of Hudson Bay. The north is what they call the Northwest Passages. There's, as you can see, as we now know, there's another way, which is Baffin Bay up the western side of Greenland, but none of this was terra nullius as far as Europe was concerned. They didn't know where to go, and they'd done some exploring around the top end of Hudson Bay, and they still weren't sure whether or not there was a route through. And as you can see, it turns out that there is a route through. So if I just concentrate on that there, you can see right at the top, it's very narrow, and it's actually only about 20 or 30 miles across, and contains a couple of islands. So at its narrowest, the straits are only about a mile or so across, 2 or 3 of them. And it was for a long time called the Strait of the Fury and Hecla, because this was the first European expedition that actually found it. And it amazes me that separates the continent of North America from Baffin Island, which, as you can see, is the top right-hand side of Northwest Passages. That's one of the largest islands in the world, much bigger than Britain. It's about 5th or 6th, depending on how you count Australia and Greenland and so on. And it is within a few miles of actually being part of North America, but there is a strong strait with currents draining through it, so that separates the two off. So They, as I say, the illustrations are great fun because they did interact very much with the local community there, and you could see doing they got the Eskimos doing what Eskimos do, hunting for fish. He's not just relaxing and having a nice time; he's catching his dinner for the night. And obviously, if he doesn't catch anything, then potentially they don't actually eat. So it is important what he's doing, and not surprisingly, the weather is not great, so they will build themselves walls of ice. And the first winter they met with locals but didn't interact with them very much. But the second winter they went to Igloolik, which was essentially the headquarters of the somewhat nomadic Inuit peoples. That's where they would return to overwinter. So at that stage they spent quite a lot of time, and this was the chief's son who was their main contact. And then these pictures of the various the women and children. They're not wearing wingsuits. They're not about to go base jumping off a mountain. That's this sort of seal skins and so on. And this is what they wore to keep warm in the very cold winter. And you can see there are also sleds pulled by huskies and so on. So it's great fun because you're waiting for all the great Eskimo or Inuit cliches to come along, and in part because the cliches, the received wisdom, what we think we know about these people, are quite often shaped by these sorts of accounts from the middle of the 19th century, when the Western explorers first talked to these people. So we'll tick off the great list. Did they build igloos out of ice blocks? And the answer to that one is definitely yes. There's even a picture. You couldn't get more igloo than that, could you? That's exactly what we'd expect an igloo to be, and that's because that genuinely is how they did build temporary houses to overwinter in. Did they rub noses to greet each other? Well, I was very pleased to read the account that one of the first times that they visited Igloolik and were invited into the houses, that the chiefs greeted each other by rubbing noses, which is a perfectly good way of making sort of contact without having to expose your hands, which might get frostbite in the fingers and so on. So good idea to use the appendages that are already exposed to the open air. So did they put their ill grannies out onto the ice floes to die, as has been alleged in various things? There's a Jack Rosenthal play called Eskimo Day about students, where they say that that's the point at which you become useless and you just get put out onto the ice floe. And the answer to that one is no, not really. They did look after their older folk. Perhaps there are sort of hints there. Various of the Inuits, when they got ill, some of them came onto the boat, and there was a case of somebody actually succumbing and dying, and the account in the journal said that they seemed curiously indifferent to the fact that they'd gone. And perhaps that might just be that you can't afford to put too much effort into mourning somebody in such extreme circumstances, or maybe they just didn't understand the sort of mourning ceremonies that went on amongst the Inuit. To begin with, the relations were very good between the two parties. They brought along lots of things to trade, and the Inuits were only too happy because they wanted iron implements and so on. Things degenerated a little bit. It was claimed the Inuits stole stuff off the boat and became more and more unreliable. I kind of wonder if you'd read the Eskimo account of the same thing, that you might say the same thing, that the sailors were initially quite friendly and then started pilfering things. I suspect there's just human nature rather than anything cultural. So I've got one last vitally important, the biggie, the really important thing is, how many words did they have for snow? You remember there's a Kate Bush album, 40 words for snow, because that's how many we're told the Eskimo have for snow. Same way as those of us who grew up on the wet side of the Pennines are alleged to have 40 words for rain. I was delighted to see that at the end of the journal was a Eskimo dictionary, and you can imagine my excitement as I thumbed through it to find to get to snow and find out how many words were listed. And there was a bit of a disappointment. There was only one. I'm not sure how many they have, but we're 39 short of the 40 required words that we need. Perhaps they didn't have room for all 40 of them. That was a bit of a disappointment reading that part of the journal. So let's go on to what was Fisher doing on this particular expedition. Well, if you go to the National and Maritime Museum in Greenwich, as I did sort of a year or so ago, in pandemic notwithstanding, in the Polar Worlds Gallery, they've got many of his instruments on display. There's his telescope, and so you can see small refractor, nothing too much, but not much was needed. He wasn't doing detailed work, it was positional primarily. And then his microscope on the left-hand side, magnetic dip recorder to see what the magnetic field was doing. He took with him, I think it's 9 chronometers, 4 of his own and 5 borrowed from various people. And the 4th instrument on the right-hand side is not Fisher's. So there's three of Fisher's plus his telescope on display. And he had many duties. If you look at his commission, there were lots and lots of things he was supposed to do. And of course, he's out there 2 years, so he had plenty of time to do them. But primarily, it's calculating the latitude and the longitude by astronomical and horological methods. They're still doing this great endeavor to find out if you could calculate the longitude as accurately by horological methods as you could by astronomical methods. And so Fisher, being an astronomer, was in an ideal position to test out both methods. The general impression being that if you're on land, actually you can calculate the longitude and so on pretty accurately. When you're at sea, it's not as good. So if you've got a chronometer that works at sea, that's probably the better way. They wanted to know more about atmospheric refraction, so he was invited to make lots of measurements of the atmospheric refraction. Of course, as they were pretty close to the magnetic pole, they wanted to know about magnetic dip and magnetic latitude, because that would be an alternative way of figuring out your position. If you noticed how much the magnet dipped as you got closer and closer to the magnetic pole, you could figure out your magnetic latitude, and you combine that with your actual latitude, your geographical latitude. That would tell you where you were on the Earth's surface. They wanted to know about extreme cold, and indeed he studied various things. He put various gases into bottles and actually lowered them down into the ocean so that it would cool as much as possible. And he spotted that at the bottom of some of these flasks there appeared to be liquefaction of gases. Shouldn't come as a surprise to us now, but actually he was a year or so ahead of Faraday, who was doing what was considered the original experiment to figure out the liquefaction of gases. Well, Fisher actually beat him to it, not under laboratory conditions, so perhaps not as reliable a measurement, but he actually spotted this is actually genuine science for the first time, seeing these things actually in the field. And of course, he was doing astronomical and meteorological things, aurora borealis, not surprisingly, parhelia, sundogs, and so on, ice crystal effects and eclipses of the sun. So looking at various things in the logs, his primary thing he had to do above all else was figure out where they were. So he had a whole winter to figure out the overwinter position. They weren't moving because they were on. What they did was to when the ice was beginning to form, as they sailed the boats as close to shore as possible, essentially into a bay and close to random aground, so that they'd be locked in position by the ice rather than being tossed around by the ice flows, and then they set up on land. So he's doing calculation of the latitude by the altitudes of the sun during the daytime and the stars at night, and so they had some pretty good accurate observations there. 66 degrees north, 11 minutes, and then it was somewhere between 24 and 26 seconds. So that's very accurate to within sort of tens to hundreds of yards. You'll notice that that's not actually inside the Arctic Circle, so the sun never actually set during their first overwintering. They're a little bit further north. Igloo, I think, might be inside the Arctic Circle. The longitude, on the other hand, as you'll know, is more difficult to calculate. That's why having a chronometer would be useful. If you're going to do it by astronomical methods, well, taking observations of the appearances and disappearance of Jupiter's satellites is a good way of doing it, because that's something that happens at the same time for observers, the same universal time for observers all over the world. When Io comes out of Jupiter's shadow, that's an event that's happening out at Jupiter rather than an event that's happening on Earth. So we all observe it at the same time. So if it's at sunset for one person and sunrise for another, you'll know that they are on different sides of the world. And you can do that more accurately. The other thing you can do is lunar distances. So you're doing parallax. You're figuring out the distance of the moon from the sun or from various stars in the sky, and that will differ depending on where you are on the Earth, because the moon is only 250,000 miles away and the stars are infinite distance away, essentially. So you can do parallax calculations. These are rigorous. They're just god-awful calculations, which you've got to do by yourself, you know, a million miles from the nearest calculator. It's not easy to do. You need to have had a good technical education to be able to do the tedious reduction of all the numbers. And you can see that nothing like as much accuracy in longitude as you get in latitude. You know, you're within, they differ by a quarter of a degree, whereas the latitude values are seconds of arc. So this explains the problem that they had and why the chronometers were so important. Just to give you a few loads and loads of astronomical entries in the diary. I've just added a few of them. Of course, they saw the aurora borealis on many occasions. Why wouldn't you? It's the most beautiful thing to see. I hope you've all seen it. I've been up into Tromsø in Norway many times and various other places, and it's beautiful things to see. And they get the most fantastic aurora, many of which they talk about here. Pencils of rays shot upwards towards the zenith. It's different from any other phenomenon of this kind, being at times a beautiful orange color, not a color you usually get. This is Parry talking in the journal. Returning on board the 11 a.m. on 27th of August 1821, found the state of the weather had prevented any observation of the eclipse of the sun which took place this morning. Mr. Fisher could only just perceive the penumbra passing over it. So it wasn't a total eclipse, but I'm sure, like me, he'd be very interested in observing a partial eclipse, and could only just see the moon passing partially over the sun. On the other hand, whilst continuing experiments on sound, they were figuring out how fast sound travel in various media. Mr. Fisher and myself remarked that Sirius, nearly on the meridian, exhibited the most beautiful violet and blue colours that can be imagined. Well, I hope you've all observed Sirius in the winter. You get flashes of colour, don't you? Because it's so low in the sky, you're getting refraction through the air cells between us and Sirius, mostly at our end. Violet to the westward, the auroras playing about at the time. Doesn't that sound lovely? The beautiful green aurora and Sirius in the middle of it, flashing beautiful violet and blue colours in the Arctic air. I thought never seen anything so brilliant that the play of prismatic colours in a cut diamond comes nearest to it. And then he talks about 21st of December 1822, the shortest day. With the sky clear overhead, Arcturus was discernible to the naked eye until 47 minutes after 11 a.m. At half an hour past noon, it was again visible. So as I say, the sun was peeped above the horizon for a few minutes on the shortest day, but Arcturus was visible almost all the time, almost all the 24 hours. And stars of the second magnitude could be distinguished at 1 o'clock. So it's fascinating culturally, it's fascinating geographically, and it's fascinating astronomically. Yeah, a couple more things, and from that, from the journal, you get sort of mirage type effects because, as in the desert, what you've got are air layers being heated by varying amounts. What you need is nice still conditions. You get them in deserts, you get them in the Arctic, and here you have an image of the moon as a crescent, and below it, I think, was an inferior mirage of the moon. So the two look almost the same, and the inverted image of the moon below and nearly touching that luminary. Yes, so the proper moon's above, and its inferior mirage inverted is below it, and so strong a mirage it almost looks as though it's a second image of the moon. Yeah, Mr. Scallon told me the image at first had been distinct as the moon itself, and was nearly so when I saw it. And then, I hope you know, is that in Arctic conditions, when it's very cold, lots of ice crystals around, and if there's sun, you get these beautiful halo type effects, which are due to refraction through ice crystals. And if there are a lot of ice crystals around, you get more and more structure to these sorts of things. So this is an example of a halo display, as noted by Parry in the journal. Not as good as the ones he'd seen on his first expedition. And on this first time he did his expedition to the Northwest Passage, this is the sort of thing that he saw. It's a picture from the South Pole. The guy there is not just trying to hog the picture. He's actually standing in front of the sun, so to block out the direct light of the sun, so that you can see the ice crystal effects around it without being washed out by the brightness of the sun. From Britain, very often, far more often than rainbows, say, you get sundogs, which is what you see to the right and to the left of the observer there. I think is at the South Pole, and then if you're lucky, you can see that the circular, the 22 degrees degrees away from the sun, this circular arc of light, circular 22-degree halo. Again, that's not uncommon. You also get the circumhorizontal arc connecting the two sundogs, that line that goes right through the middle of the guy, and then you get the tangent arcs to the top. And now we'll be getting to interesting things there, because you get the arc touching the top of the 22-degree halo, and then the things to the side of it, and then very occasionally, under just the right circumstances, you get that continuation of the arc, the very top arc of ice crystal halo there, and that is called the Parry arc. The first person to describe it was William Edward Parry on his first expedition to the Northwest Passage. And in fact, that's how I knew Parry, because I'm interested in these sorts of things. So I knew there was a thing called the Parry arc. Didn't know very much about the guy after whom it was named. Very pleased to see that was a chap, a rugby astronomer, actually joining him on these expeditions. And you see the cause there. I would recommend very much, if you go to Les Cowley's fantastic, superb atmospheric optics page, atoptics.co.uk, that explains these things much better than I can do. I'm merely an interested party. Les does the most fantastic, clear explanation of what's going on. So first recorded in 1820 during his search for the Northwest Passage. The arcs are rare, and what you need is ice crystals that are like pencil-like crystals. They all have hexagonal crystals. It's just a case of whether or not they're more like beer mats, very flat, or pencils, very long. So you need pencil-like crystals, very sound conditions. So not only do they fall horizontal, but they fall with the bottom face horizontal as well. They're not just spinning, as it were, or a very random orientation. So when you've got that very calm situation, you get the top bit, the Parry arc there. So I wondered whether or not the Parry arc had been first discovered on the expedition Fisher was on, and it turns out to be no. It had been 2 or 3 years previously, but they still saw these beautiful ice crystal displays, and of course they were anxious to record them for the benefit of the learned societies back in England. So a lot of science going on there, and a lot of cultural stuff about joining the locals and so on. Did they make any progress? Well, the answer to that is yes, they did. They were the first Westerners to see the Strait of the Fury and Heckler. I've kind of given it away. That was named after the two boats. But they knew, even before they got there, they knew it was there, and they knew that for 2 reasons. First of all, there was a very strong current, which suggested that something was draining into the Northwest Passages. But the second reason why they knew the thing was there was because the locals had told them. They said there's a strait you could try and sail through. So to what extent had they actually discovered these things? Very looking back on things, it's like David Livingstone discovering Victoria Falls, which must have come to a surprise to the people who actually live there. They were undoubtedly the first people from Europe to actually come across this strait. So one should give them some credit for that, but I think you should give rather more credit to the people who actually lived in these extreme circumstances and actually knew about the local geography. Intriguingly, the explanation given in Parry's book is that they did know about it, but they didn't have that much sense of direction. What they'd say was, you come to this if you walk for 3 days upstream, shall we say, along the beach in that direction, or as opposed to the other direction. And that, I think that they were somewhat liminal people. They lived on the shores. They didn't go inland too much. It's certainly not during the winter. To say you walk that way for 3 days, it actually took you in a big loop round until you got to the entrance of to the strait. So full credit, I think, to the Inuit who with a somewhat local knowledge of things. They attempted to go sail through the strait, but the ice was just too thick. They needed an icebreaker, or certainly a more fortified boat to actually be able to sail through the strait. So they didn't get any further than finding that there was a way out of the Northwest Passage, rather than actually going through and seeing what was there. That was later on the Franklin's catastrophic expedition, where everybody died and half of them eat each other and so on, later on in the century. So Parry's expedition made progress and was judged to be Oh, yeah, sorry, a couple more things to show you. Again, Marty Stein, who studied these Arctic expeditions, pointed at me these beautiful paintings by the American artist Richard Schlecht. Still with us, I think, but getting on a bit. He produces illustrations for National Geographic. If there's no photos, which of course there weren't in 1821, so he produced these beautiful paintings to show what things were like. And to my mind, they actually take you there as to what it was like in the high Arctic, trying to sail a sailboat through the pack ice. You had to tow it with the boat. You didn't have a nuclear powered icebreaker to go through. If you got stuck, and you died there. And sometimes they had to pull the ship out of the ice. And after they'd overwintered, they actually had to cut their way out. They had these big saws and they cut a channel for the boat to sail through. Doesn't that really bring it to you? They cut it out with the saws, hard physical work for the crew, and then they got ropes and they hauled the boat out from its winter harboring out to the open sea, perhaps half a mile away. It really was extraordinary expedition. I mean, I can't begin to think how much more difficult it would be than anything that we do these days. And it was judged to be a great commemorative success. Great public interest. Commemorative souvenirs were sold. I like this one. This is a commemorative dish, and you can see there is the Fury and the Heckler there in a very stylized Arctic, and in the foreground sleds and huskies and so on. What I really like about it on the outside, look at all the animals there. There's lions and tigers and things. I suspect what happened was that their African dinner set wasn't selling very well. So when Parry came back from the Arctic, they quickly repurposed it and painted some Arctic scenes in the middle, but they didn't have time to put polar bears and stuff on the outside. So lions would have to do for the outside of the commemorative crockery. I guess it's the same sort of thing, for when Amundsen and Scott were going to the South Pole, and arguably even sort of, Armstrong and Aldrin to the moon. It attracted public attention. People were enthralled by these great expeditions and wanted a memorandum of the extraordinary things that had happened there. And the establishment agreed. The establishment may have wanted to say how good the expedition was, regardless of how good it actually was. But they were awarded, many members of the crew, the Arctic Medal. So that is the middle one of the three there. And the Arctic Medal is something not to be sniffed at. It's a very, very high honour to be awarded by the sovereign. See, there she is on there, a very young-looking Victoria on the medal. And the Arctic Medal is still awarded. My colleague, former director of the Comet section, Jonathan Shanklin, some of you may know, he's a member of the British Antarctic Survey. He has travelled to Antarctica on many occasions. He's got a glacier named after him these days in Antarctica, and he's also been awarded the Arctic Medal, or the Antarctic Medal in those cases. So it is, it's still there. It's still done for excellent work in the polar regions. And Fisher, as far as we know, is the only chaplain ever to have received that Arctic Medal. So that was this last time he actually went to the Arctic, was on this expedition, and as I say, he was judged to have been a great success in what he did, and was elected to the Royal Society, and very much a member of its council until his retirement in 1863. Vice president several times, but never actually the president. And he was also elected to the Royal Astronomical Society, which only been formed in 1820, but he joined it in 1827. And both the Royal Society and the RAS produced an obituary for him when he died in the 1870s. So he then joined another boat, HMS Spartiate, carrying out magnetic observations. They really, as I was saying to you earlier, they wanted to know about magnetic dips all the way around the world so that you could use that as an alternative method of figuring out where you were. And he also sailed on HMS Hero to the West Indies. And I'll tell you about a possible astronomical observation he made on there. He gave papers to the Royal Society, magnetic variations in the Mediterranean, which is where I think he was with HMS Spartiate. And this one I like. His very final posting in the Navy was to HMS Victory. Then as now, it was no longer an active boat, but I hope you've all been on the HMS Victory in Portsmouth docks. It hasn't seen water in going on for 2 centuries now, but it is still the oldest commissioned boat in the Royal Navy, and the people who serve on it, generally, I think it is something you do towards the end of your career, but they are proud to be part of the history of HMS Victory, and I'm sure same would probably be true for Fisher. Again, then as now, I think the Royal Navy is a young man's career. You do it until you into your 40s or so on, and that's indeed pretty much what he did. He was in late 30s, I think he left the service of the Navy. He was offered various things. He was offered a living. He was offered a post to be a vicar up in Northumberland, but that I think was too far from London, so he elected to stay in London and became the headmaster and the chaplain of the Greenwich Hospital School. And the idea behind this was to take first of all, orphans from people who died in the Napoleonic Wars. This is what it was founded for, and then later the sons, not daughters, but the sons of sailors, to teach them navigational skills to bring along the next generation to become useful sailors. So it's a very technical school. Vocational is the word I'm going for. Vocational school to teach the next generation of the Navy. It's housed in what is now the National Maritime Museum. Again, I hope you've been to Greenwich and had a look around the Maritime Museum. It's an excellent place down at the bottom of the hill from the Greenwich Observatory. And he was there for many years, going on 30 years. He was the headmaster for the first 6 years or so, and chaplain only from 1840 onwards. You've got to search quite deeply to find that actually in 1840 people started complaining that he wasn't spending enough time doing his duties as a chaplain, spending far too much time being a headmaster. So I think he was probably given the choice, one or the other, and he decided that his calling as a minister was more important than his calling as a school teacher. But he was pretty good, I think, as a school teacher. Modern teaching methods, including test results, examinations, and so on, things that are second nature to us today. Well, that's not what they did in those days, apparently, and so he introduced us to the more modern methods of teaching things and then examining to make sure that people knew what they'd done. And most interestingly, he actually built an observatory at the school. Difficult to find on the internet information about this, because if you type in Greenwich Observatory, you get a different one, not surprisingly. So it's very difficult to disentangle anything from the great Greenwich Observatory, for the Royal Observatory at the top of the hill, from the school observatory down the bottom of the hill. And I emailed my friend Louise Devoy from the National Maritime Museum. She pointed me at one or two books in, but I don't think there's very much about that Greenwich Observatory, which I suspect means that it wasn't used too much. So I did, while I was at Greenwich looking in the Polar Galleries, I'd actually gone along and to the library there and requested files on Fisher. Amusingly, they give you this great list of things you have to do in the COVID era, and all the precautions that you have to take, and how everything has to be booked out in advance, and so on and so forth. And I get there and they say, "Oh, hello, Mr. Frost," and I was about the only person who'd actually visiting that day, so I had the place more or less to myself. And so I was able to look through some of the files, not all of them, but quite some, and fascinating they are. Whilst he was at Greenwich, he was still doing astronomical activities, but they were more connected with his previous career. For example, he carried on rating chronometers. In his rooms, he'd have half a dozen chronometers from various manufacturers around Britain, around the world, and he'd see how they all did against each other and against absolute measurements from time from up the top of the hill at the Greenwich Observatory. So he was still doing useful work. And his notebooks contain various calculations of longitude, moving on from the work he'd done up in the Arctic. For example, an intriguing one from an eclipse in the Grand Bahamas, which I presume was when he was on HMS Hero and his expedition. And as far as I can see, and I had to sort of backward engineer from the calculations, I think it's from the altitude of the sun during the eclipse. So if you know how high in the sky the sun was at when the total eclipse began, you can figure out exactly where you were on the eclipse track. I think that's what he was doing. So that's quite a novel way of measuring longitude. You do need a total eclipse of the sun, so it's not one that you can do on the fly, as it were. You don't wait for the next total eclipse to happen. You're going to wait a long time. He's also doing the longitude calculations for the Hartwell Observatory out in Berkshire, where John Lee and many others, actually, it's very important place in observational astronomy at this time. They produced excellent moon maps at that time. And Herr Rumke's observatory in Hamburg. And he talks about observations of meteors and thoughts on the aurora borealis. He's seen that and he's intrigued to know what causes it, and he puts forward his own theory. You don't need to read all this. He talks about sea blink, which are the clouds that form on the edge of the ice where it's becoming to the open sea. So there's a difference in temperature and you get cloud formations there. And he thinks it's something to do with that. He concludes the aurora borealis, right in the middle now, is an electrical phenomenon arising from the positive electricity of the atmosphere developed by the rapid condensation in the vapor in the act of freezing, which you're going to get around this sea blink area on the edge of the pack ice, and the induced negative electricity of the surrounding portions of the atmosphere. In tropical and temperate climates, down at the bottom, this phenomenon does not occur because the electric equilibrium is destroyed by means of aqueous vapors. It's hotter. You've got vapor rather than ice crystals and so on. So it's intriguing. This is somebody who studied the aurora borealis directly for 2 years up in the north, and he thinks it's something meteorological relatively close to the surface. He would be, I think, just astonished to know what we now know 2 centuries further on. Now we've got satellites and so on, that the aurora do not follow the sea blink. They do not follow the surface of the pack ice. They go in an oval all the way around each of the 2 poles. They cross dry land, they cross the oceans and so on. It's nothing to do with the ice boundary. He'd be flabbergasted to know that the northern and the southern lights, as the aurora borealis, the aurora australis, are quite often in sync with each other. You get a good display in the northern hemisphere, you more often than not get a good display in the southern hemisphere as well. So clearly it has nothing to do with sea blink and everything to do with the solar wind. Solar wind's coming from the sun. It's swept round the earth by the magnetic field of the earth. On the far side, it reconnects, and that reconnection sometimes spills particles into the field lines heading down towards the poles. I make that very simple. There are excellent books that explain this in more detail, but it is fascinating stuff. And I'm quite intrigued by the fact he's doing his best to explain what it was. He gets it wrong, but so did everybody else. It was Birkeland, back end of the 19th century, who finally figured out it had something to do with particles arriving from the sun. And even then, the British scientists poo-pooed him. What does this Norwegian chap think he knows about? Well, in fact, he did. And all the scientists in Britain and America and elsewhere were all wrong. It's Birkeland who figured it all out, and Fisher didn't, which may be one reason he's not very well known. So one last thing from the Greenwich Observatory. In 1860, there was a solar eclipse. Yay, I love solar eclipses. Total across Spain. So very easy to get to. 2026, we're going to get a total eclipse across Spain. 2027 as well, I think. Check your diaries beforehand, but we've got 2 coming up. And Fisher, it was deep partial from England, 90% or so. So Fisher submitted observations from the school. So the observatory was in usage. On the other hand, they're very unexciting observations. They're observations of the altitude of the sun in the sky rather than any descriptions of what was going on with the eclipse. So once again, he's the positional astronomer rather than the descriptive astronomer. And if you look in the monthly notions, there are all sorts of observations, many from Spain, many from Britain. William Rutter Dawes contributed from Herefordshire, I think is where he was. Captain William Noble, first president of the first chairman of the Royal BAA, he contributed observations from the London area, and then many observations from Totale from Spain, including James Morris Wilson, a master at Rugby School, and a recent paper in the RAS put all these pictures of the 1860 eclipse, including Wilson. You can see him there, middle side on the left-hand side. And you can see many of them have this sort of curious feature, bottom right-hand corner there, this sort of loop, because in 1860, there was a coronal mass ejection from the sun in progress during the eclipse. Coronal mass ejections happen, they are not uncommon. They happen about once every 3 days, and they're about 2 hours or so in duration. So in any given total eclipse of the sun, you've got about a 1 in 36 chance of there being coronal mass ejection in progress. On the other hand, if it's shooting towards you, the moon's going to be in the way during a total eclipse, and if you're not in a total eclipse, you're not going to be able to see it because the sun's too bright. If it's shooting away from the sun, well, both the moon and the sun are in the way, so you're not going to see it. So only about half coronal mass ejections will you actually see if they're in progress during a total eclipse. So 1 in 72 chance that you'll be able to, there's a coronal mass ejection that you might be able to see. And total eclipses of the sun occur about once every 18 months. So you'd expect there to be around about once every century or so a coronal mass ejection in progress during a total eclipse. Well, actually, it was worse than the odds that the next eclipse that we know about that actually had a coronal mass ejection in progress was this one, 2020, from Patagonia. And this fantastic, possible, I claim this is the best ever picture taken of a total eclipse of the sun, with that beautiful coronal mass ejection in progress on the left-hand side there. This was processed by Miroslav Drukmiller from the Czech Republic, but he wasn't present. It's actually taken by Andreas Moller from Berlin, and Andreas was stood about 10 yards from me in a field in the middle of Patagonia on the trip to see the eclipse, which I was fortunate enough to be the guest astronomer on. I give a talk on this as well. That's an amazing thing. Right in the middle of the pandemic, we were the first foreign tourists into Argentina in several months, and we saw a beautiful, beautiful eclipse. So as far as I know, there have only ever been 2 eclipses visible in the modern era with coronal mass ejection in progress during the eclipse, and for both of them, there was an astronomer from Rugby present. So we're 2 from 2 at the moment. Let's see what happens next time it goes on. Let's tell you a little bit more about Fisher's personal circumstances. He married Elizabeth Alicia Woosnam in 1838, which is about the time that he left the Navy. But although they had 3 children, 2 daughters, Alice and Elizabeth, who I'll tell you about, and the son, George, about whom I don't know anything, maybe died young. But his wife actually died only after 8 years or so of marriage, unfortunately. And to tell you a little bit more about his brothers, again, he had 3 brothers about whom we know about 2, and his elder brother, James Hertel Fisher, is a very significant figure. He immigrated to Australia, and he helped to establish the South Australia colony. He was one of the first people to be knighted for his contributions to the empire in Australia. And indeed, Adelaide has a square named after him, Hertel Square in Adelaide, and it's not named because the traffic hurtles around it. It's named after James Hertel Fisher. I've been to Adelaide, and I may even have been round Hertel Square, but obviously I had no idea what the connection was back to people I knew from rugby. So that was the eldest brother, who very much distinguished himself, and the next brother along, Edward, may have been George's twins. The dates are pretty close, but he moved up to Market Harborough. And he founded a surveying, a land economy company there, which is still going. There it is, up at the top there. Fisher German, combined with I don't know, Mr. German or the German company or whatever. And indeed, that's how Bob Hakewell got to know about Fisher. He was researching the people behind the Fisher German company. And he found all these interesting people, South Australia and so on. And then he found an astronomer, and he thought, I might like to know about it. So that's the reason I know all about this, is the connection to Market Harborough and the surveying company. And we still really don't quite know why Rugby, but George's wife actually died visiting Edward and a wife in Market Harborough. So it suggests that the families were close, and it's maybe that he moved to Rugby to be close, but not too close to his brother to still lead his own life, or perhaps he wanted to be close to relatives, but he ended up 10 miles or so away. So retirement to rugby, as I say, in the back end of the 1860s, and wasn't there for very long, into the 1870s before he died. But intriguingly, as I alluded to earlier on, he actually lived where this place was. Just across the road is the rugby school buildings. It's quite a large campus rugby school these days, and included in it is rugby school's Temple Observatory. James Morris Wilson, I just told you about, observed from the school in the 1860s, but most particularly his pupil, George Mitchell Seabrook, very distinguished observer, BAA President, 1900 to 1902, very good planetary observer. And even as he was a student, he was interested in astronomy, but I think he went away to become a solicitor, but as soon as he got back, he founded the Temple Observatory in 1870, just after Fisher had arrived there. So it's possible, I'd love to be able to tell you that Fisher observed with Wilson or Seabrook, but so far I haven't researched enough to be able to say whether or not this was the case. They like Seabrook at rugby school. I've visited The Temple Observatory, the school's astronomy society is named the Seabrook Society after George Mitchell Seabrook. So one day perhaps I will get a chance to look through their records, and maybe I will find out whether or not Fisher actually observed with them. If he did, I'm sure it wasn't very onerous, because it was not very long before he passed away. So he was in the latter years of his life. Lived with his daughter, the dutiful daughter who looked after him, and you think, oh well, good for her, sacrificing her own career so that she could look after her ailing father. Well, proves how wrong I am. Shouldn't make assumptions about these things. George Fisher is in the Dictionary of National Biography, because quite an important figure in the history of astronomy. Alice Fisher is also in the Dictionary of National Biography, quite astonishingly so. I mean, they don't let anybody in, and they let Alice Fisher in for not one but two reasons. First of all, she was a novelist. During the time she was looking after her father, she actually wrote two novels. Here they are: Too Bright to Last, published in 1873, and the 3-volume His Queen, published in 1876. I have read the former, so you don't have to. It's a Victoria. It is not Jane Austen. It is not George Eliot. George Eliot is from Nuneaton, just up the road. So I wondered whether she might have known Alice Fisher, but she'd already moved to London in a somewhat scandalous relationship. So perhaps they met, but they were not close. It's a melodrama. It's a classic Victorian melodrama. It's a story of a love story between Georgina Soakville from a genteel, not too well-off London family, and a very handsome Brecknockshire hill farmer called Simon Vane. And if there's a theme, it's the classic British class situation. Is it okay to love somebody outside your social standing? And of course, love finds a way, though in a very Victorian way. I'm sorry if I'm spoiling the plot for you. Spoilers alert. She dies at the end, and just in time. At the beginning of the final chapter, she's feeling a bit peaky and has come home to be with her mum. And by the end of the chapter, she has not only told off her evil suitor who's trying to pull her away from him, but her love of her life has arrived just in time for her to expire in his arms. It's all very almost ludicrously over the top. I was actually laughing at places I wasn't supposed to laugh. So Too Bright to Laugh it's readable, but it's not not classic Victorian literature. I haven't had the strength to attempt the 3 volumes of His Queen. So she wrote novels that I'm sure were popular, sold quite well. I mean, they sort of, that sort of, I'm sure they were penny dreadfuls that would sell pretty well. But after George Fisher died, she changed career. She became a nurse. Not only a nurse, very, very successful in a quite short career, superintendent nurse at Adam Brooks in Cambridge, at Birmingham, and the Radcliffe in Oxford. And her mentor was none other than Florence Nightingale. And obviously, Florence Nightingale, she's famous not only for the Crimean War, but because she revolutionized nursing throughout Britain. And so she would talk to very capable women like Alice Fisher, who were superintending these great hospitals. So they have correspondence from Florence to Alice Fisher, I think, in the British Library. I haven't read it, but shows you how it's held in esteem. But after a few years knocking around the great hospitals of Britain, she actually emigrated to the United States to become superintendent of the Philadelphia Hospital and actually start the nursing profession on the other side of the Atlantic. And she wrote an article, which I have read, on nursing in America. It's a popular one in the London magazines. And essentially what she says in it is, if you don't like nursing in Britain, then you're not going to like nursing in America. If, on the other hand, you love nursing in Britain and you want to emigrate to America, please come. You'll be very welcome. So she's saying if it's your vocation, there is a place for you in New England. Philadelphia is not quite New England, but it's in the great cities of North America. And she died in 1888, so she didn't last that long. It was only 4 years in America, and she's only at late 40s, I think, when she died. But she is very recognized. Every year, nurses of Philadelphia dress up in traditional Victorian nursing gear and walk to her grave to lay flowers on her grave. So he's very much appreciated. This is not somebody that say, you think dutiful daughter, suburban town of Rugby, yeah, that's all there is to her. Very much not. Successful novelist, kick-started the nursing profession in North America. Extraordinary woman. So very capable family. So his last days, he died in 1873, you see, so he wasn't in rugby for that long. His very last paper was a chapter on circular arc sailing in Riddle's Navigation, which was the textbook, the definitive textbook on navigation during the Victoria. It went through many editions, and so and again, if you read the article, that it's they paid great esteem. They said this: we got the guy who knows more about navigation than anybody else to tell us about this. And here he is, Reverend Fisher. And I was kind of hoping that it would tell you how he managed to do sailing up in the very high latitudes, you know, and towards the Arctic area. But actually, it's a paper on how to avoid sailing to high latitudes if you're making a journey. And he gives the example. I think it's Cape Town to Van Diemen's Land, Tasmania. If the shortest route is the Great Circle, but that would take you right down to Antarctica, and you don't want to do that. So essentially, what you do is sail the Great Circle as long as you can until you get to the last latitude that you're happy sailing at. And when you get to, I don't know, 35 south or something like that, then you sail along the line of latitude until you pick up the Great Circle again and continue that way. That was his recommendation, and he has worked examples how to do that. So he died in 1873. Although he was still living in Rugby, he was buried in Little Bowden, the home of his brother. And this is the church in Little Bowden, and the church has a memorial on it, put up by the other sister, who, as we see, was not in the Dictionary of National Biography. To the glory of God, loving memory of Reverend George Fisher, MA from Cambridge, Fellow Royal Society, Fellow Royal Astronomical Society, sometimes Vice President of the Royal Society. This font was placed here by his daughter, Elizabeth Darnell, not the novelist, wife of the Reverend C. Darnell, MA, of Cargillfield, Edinburgh. So she's done fairly well for herself. She's married well, married a reverend who wants to make sure he appears on the monument as well. But they clearly a family who were appreciative of him. His other daughter was in America at the time, but the other one, the Scottish one, stepped up to put the memorial onto the plate. So I hope you'll agree, it's an extraordinary career. I love these people who nobody has ever heard of, who lead these extraordinary astronomical activities. In his time, he was very well known. Like many people from the Victorian era, his big ideas on the cause of the aurora, that sort of thing, were not correct. So that's, I think, is why he's not renowned in the textbooks. But he lived an interesting, productive life from an interesting, productive, extraordinary story, extraordinary family. And I hope very much that you've enjoyed me telling you all about it. So thank you very much.
I'm going to ask you to stop sharing. And
yep.
I'm going to ask people, if I can get the gallery together, if they've got any questions, would like to electronically show a hand or wave at me, bearing in mind that I'm trying to look at your faces on lots and lots of squares. So electronic hand would be preferable, but otherwise, if you want to ask a question, just wave. Can't see anything at the moment. I think. Oh, we have a question from William at Cleethorpes. If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yeah, very interesting talk. Very interesting person that they were telling us about. It is interesting how these people disappear through history, but it's not really connected with the astronomy or anything like that. But just wondering, the expedition to the Arctic had to sort of retreat because of the outbreak of scurvy. How do the Inuits manage not to have scurvy?
Yeah,
no.
Yeah, they didn't have very many lemons, did they? In the Inuit, that is a really good question, because I don't think their diet was particularly good.
No.
You know, they not quite scavenged. They weren't growing crops or anything like that, so they wouldn't be eating that many vegetables and so on. I wonder if there's partly a genetic side to it, that Europeans are more predisposed to it, or was it something, if you eat all the bits of the seal, that the bits that we might turn down, perhaps they're the ones that give you the right protection. But yeah, good question. not one I thought about. Incidentally, I've also talked to Cleethorpes. nice to see you guys again. It's been a while since I've been up there.
Yeah.
Long way to drive. I have to say, I'm getting a bit old to go all the way back to Rugby from Cleethorpes.
Okay, thanks.
Well, we've got a hand.
Yes, it's me again.
Sorry, William, if you'd like to ask.
Yeah, just wondering how good were the chronometers that he was using? That he was, because he was obviously testing and evaluating them, and I suppose proving.
I mean, Harrison was decades in the past, so I think
yes,
they'd solved the problem. They knew chronometers worked, and now they were at the stage of figuring out who made the best chronometers. So I think it's evaluation. It's not proof of concept anymore. It was evaluation of who made the best chronometers. So I'm going to guess, seconds worth of accuracy. That they're so much as good as and probably better than the best of the Harrison ones, which is not to do down the Harrison ones, because the technical problems he had to overcome just extraordinary.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, anybody got anything else quickly before we move on to the next part of the evening?
Oh, I've just got one quick question,
Gary?
if I may. Yeah, I was just curious about how magnetic dip, how accurate was it for actually determining your latitude? Because I don't hear about it anymore. I know we obviously got GPS, but did it only last for a few decades and disappear, or what?
I mean, I think it's a good backup method, but I just thinking about how accurately you're going to be able to measure the dip of a magnetic needle. If you've only got 90 degrees to play with, and that 1 degree is roughly the equivalent of 1 degree of latitude. So you're not going to be able to measure. You're not going to be able to measure seconds of
so the error is so big, it's impractical to use in any practical way. Yeah.
But as a means of telling you approximately where you are, why not use it if it's there?
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
No, I think you've bamboozled everybody, Mike. So if everybody would like to show an appreciation of thanks to Mike Frost for such an interesting and detailed talk.